Hello, everybody. This is Stav Karras, and today we are going to do a tier list ranking of the Van Halen albums. So, Van Halen has been a pretty prominent part of my musical life growing up. I have my guitar teacher to thank for that. So, if you're listening to this, Casey, thank you very much. I'm sure Van Halen has influenced me in one way or another. They are certainly one of the pillars of the rock world and have influenced and inspired the music world in many, many ways. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this is going to be done in two parts. In part one, I'm going to do Van Halen 1 up until OU812, and then in the second part, I'll do the latter, just to make it a little bit more digestible for viewers. So without further ado, let's go. Uh okay, Van Halen 1. I think this is a pretty easy one, and I would say this is a quite a non-controversial view that Van Halen 1 is S tier, if not the best album they've done. I don't know if it's my favorite personally, but I would certainly say it is one of the best. I don't think there is a weak song on it. So you've obviously got the hits such as Ain't Talking About Love, Eruption, Running with the Devil, You Really Got Me. Then you have some of the more obscure ones such as On Fire, I'm the One, Atomic Punks, Little Dreamer, but the list goes on. It's a fantastic album already right out of the gate. They were setting trends for what music in the rock world was going to sound like for the next 10 or so years and beyond. They already sounded like themselves for a lack of a better expression. So really they hit it out of the park, and this was most of their biggest hits in the first album already. So amazing. Van Halen 2. So Van Halen 2, I would say, is very close to being on par with Van Halen 1, but not just a little bit under, but it's still an S tier album. There's still, I would say, probably not a bad song on it. So you have Dance the Night Away, you have Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Light Up the Sky, Spanish Fly, You're No Good, Out of Love Again, Dead or Alive. Production wise, very similar, powerful, clean, dynamic. Everyone sounds like themselves. Something I forgot to mention in the previous album, but this is going to be a general theme amongst most of the albums, that Michael Anthony's backing vocals are a very prominent part of the sound, on top of Eddie Van Halen's, pioneering guitar techniques and Alex Van Halen's signature sound and David Lee Roth's signature voice. He was a very underrated part of the sound that I think gets overlooked quite a bit, and I think he added to that Van Halen sound. But great album. I love Van Halen too. I think it's a fantastic album. Women and Children First. Okay, so 1980 to start off the new decade. This was a fantastic album, and this saw the first, I believe, the first use of keyboards in Van Halen songs. So for all the people out there that say, "Oh, the Sammy era brought in all the use of the keyboards and all that," like, shut your face. This was already happening very early on. Like 6 years prior. I mean, well, so yeah, a bit of a silly argument to make. A lot of those stylistic choices were Eddie. Yeah, when people say that, it almost sounds like it was Sammy's fault, when really I think he was just entering the scene. But anyways, Women and Children First is a fantastic album. Production wise, very similar to the two prior albums. It's got And That Cradle with Rock, Tora Tora and Loss of Control. Could This Be Magic? Romeo Delight. Again, very, very strong album. I personally think it's one of their heaviest. A lot of people say that the next, like the upcoming album from here, For Fair Warning, is their heavy album, but this certainly stands on its own 2 feet as quite a heavy rocker, especially for the context of 1980. This was a very heavy, evil sounding album, and I quite like it. So S tier for sure. Again, not really a weak tune on this album. All right, let's move on. Fair Warning. Okay, this is a bit of a tough one because, again, this is a very loved one amongst Van Halen fans, probably a bit more to the diehards, but obviously the casual fan will love this as well. My favorite tracks off of this are Mean Street, obviously Unchained, but then there are some other great ones such as Sinners Swing, Dirty Movies, Push Comes to Shove. It's a good album, but this is where I'm starting to notice that there is a little bit of filler. I don't know if I like things like what's it called? Sunday Afternoon in the Park. It feels like a bit of a filler track to me, but then there's some other great ones as well. So I think you just got to find what works on the album. But look, it's a well done record. There's good tracks on it. It's clearly still very innovative, especially on Eddie's part, but it doesn't hit me the same as the first three albums. But still, I mean, fantastic musicianship. Obviously, it's Van Halen. Okay, Dive It Down. So Dive It Down's gonna be a little bit of a tough one to rank considering it's half covers, so it's not very easy to give it a very fair rating. But if you look at the context of everything and I guess look at the big picture, I would still rate it as a B tier album. It's probably going to be the weakest of the Roth albums, especially from the classic era. Obviously, there's good originals on there as well, such as Little Guitars. I think that's fantastic, but they also put their spin on covers very well, such as Dancing in the Street, Pretty Woman. Um, look, it's well done in how they play. I just again think that you can hear they weren't really ready to put out a studio album yet. I believe that they actually weren't looking to put an album out just yet by this point, but the record label had pressured them to put out something. So they had to rush to put all these extra bits of material on, and that's probably the explanation for all the extra covers. But you know what? Decent, but certainly the weakest of the Roth era. 1984. Okay, so this is the final album of the classic Roth era. Again, stands on its own 2 feet for an incredible amount of hits, such as Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, Drop Dead Legs. I don't know if that's a hit, but still like a pretty prominent song in their set lists. Look, I consider it an A tier album. I don't consider it S tier. It's obviously fantastic, but again, for my personal taste, it just doesn't hit me the same as the first three albums. 1984, the title track is a little bit of filler. Obviously, it's cool synths and whatever, but doesn't feel like it needs to be there. Stuff like Girl Gone Bad and Top Jimmy feel like they're okay, but certainly don't stand up against the latter of the album, or at least the rest of the stronger songs. So that brings it down a little bit. But I guess what a way to end the classic Roth era. It certainly again stands on its own 2 feet as a monumental, powerful album. So moving on. All right. Dave out, Sammy in. 5150. This is a slightly tough one to rank. Look, music-wise, very strong. Awesome. Great album cover, by the way. Not many bands get to have such a revival with a new member like Van Halen did with Sammy Hagar. You get the odd ones, such as AC/DC with Brian Johnson. But again, those I would consider to be musical anomalies. But Sammy Hagar, I think, was the guy for the job. He breathed new life into Van Halen. I think they felt musically free. They felt creatively liberated. And I think this shows up in the music. Things like Summer Nights and Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams. Love Walks In. I personally love Inside as well. All very strong songs, and they sound like they can breathe. They don't sound like they're crushed down by any creative barriers or restrictions. The only thing I'm probably not a huge fan of about this album is the production. I think it sounds a little bit muddy and a little bit unfocused, but again, this is probably just the band finding their sound. And this is the first time that I think Eddie Van Halen's guitars in the stereo setting are now in the left and the right. Oh, left and right, sorry. Whereas previously in the albums before this, Eddie Van Halen's guitar was just in the left to give the sound of a live show, considering like he'd be standing on one side with his amp. So they've changed the sound, but again, I think it was due for a change. Great album, A tier, but again, it's obviously not going to contend with the first three albums. That's a bit of a task. And finally for this part, OU 812. Oh man, this is tough. I have to say this is probably the weakest one. Yeah, this is the weakest one I'd say of the Sammy era, or one of the weakest. Look, it's obviously got its very strong songs on it, such as When It's Love and Finish What You Started and Cabo Wabo, Black and Blue. But it's also, and I also love Mine All Mine. That's a very powerful one. but it's also got its set of weaker tracks such as Sucker in a Three Piece or a Apolitical Blues. Apolitical Blues just sounds like a jam track that they just threw on there for no reason. It doesn't have much of a purpose. It's just in existence, I guess. And production wise, it's a little thin. So it obviously doesn't stand up. I think Van Halen suffered from the sophomore slump with Sammy rather than with Roth. And you can really hear it on this album. But obviously, it was a number one album for them. So, like, who the hell am I to say anything? But for my personal taste, probably the weakest of the Sammy era. All right. So that is the tier list up until this point. Catch you in the next part. Thank you, guys.